Hi, welcome to our Pacifica Network 24-hour MayDay 2020 coverage show. In this program, we will be presenting the historic events and the current issues in Turkey that pertains to the working class and issues surrounding it there. MayDay is a significant part of Turkey's left tradition, and every year a united workers' movement struggle to celebrate it and celebrate it at the traditional location, the Taksim Square in Istanbul. However, the pro-business, the capitalist government invariably puts roadblocks and bans to prevent the celebrations. The workers, unions, and people's organizations fight to reclaim the plaza back from the heavily surrounded Taksim Square. This year, the AKP government is using the COVID-19 pandemic as the excuse to ban the May Day celebrations again. As if the virus only infects on certain dates, the capitalist government juggles to keep businesses open for the economy on the one hand, while fearing the spread of the disease may get worse on the other. Using this pretext, the government has brought a curfew on May 1st, but allows other days to operate as usual for workers to go to work. The events around this curfew and the working class's reaction will be discussed in my interview, and activists and journalists throughout this program. We also have a segment on the tradition of May Day in Turkey, especially as it turned out to be quite bloody in 1977, with a government-involved mass shooting of the protesters, where 34 workers lost their lives and many more wounded. After seeing that segment, it should become clear why May Day has become a symbol of resistance, a tradition that the working classes hold dear and will never surrender to pressures of the bosses. As is the tradition, we should start with the International March, which is the symbol of all working classes of the world in Turkish, though. Here is the International, sung in Turkish and put together by Murat Üner from Turkey on his YouTube channel. Hi, this is Mehmet Bayram, and we are going to be now going to somebody from Turkey, a student, to talk about the last year and the current situations in Turkey on what labor movement means, what labor movement has done, and where it is now, especially being hit with the coronavirus epidemic around the world. So we're going to be talking mostly about the May Day and how it's being celebrated and how it has been celebrated. But our guest tonight is a student in the U.S. But due to Turkish government's traditional retaliation against anybody that criticizes it or says anything opposing the Turkish government, there's huge retaliation, and they do get back to people. Currently in Turkey, there are more than 150 people being investigated, being questioned, just for posting on their social media sites their views or what they have seen around them about coronavirus disease. Turkey does not tolerate people reporting on what they have seen, and there are many people in the hospitals, and you are not allowed to even speak about those, if especially it contradicts the official truth that is being given by the Turkish government. So that's why we are not going to be revealing the identity of our guest, but he's a student from Turkey. He was an activist in Turkey. He's an activist here. So we'd like to conceal his name and face, and we can go directly to our questions and answers. He agreed graciously to step up to the MayDay programming that's happening around the country on Pacifica networks. And this is a special programming that we are doing, 24-hour programming that does include, a lot of countries around the world. And we are really happy to have one guest from Turkey that will explain things as we go into the program. Now, what is the history of May Day and the struggles to celebrate the May Day in Turkey? There has been some bloody events that have happened.
That's right.
So
That's
please
right.
go ahead and explain what is the problem with May Days and the Turkish governments.
Sure. Well, first of all, before going into your question, thanks for having me on this platform, and thanks for doing this because, um, I mean, we're facing a global pandemic, and global solidarity is the key. The way out of this mess.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to go back to your question, I think the May Day has a similar history in Turkey and similar to the history here in the United States. As you would know, here in the United States, it actually originates from the spring rites, the spring celebration of the native peoples. But, it is crowned, unfortunately, with blood. And I'm thinking of the Haymarket Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in Turkey, the beginnings of May had been the Ederlezi and like other spring rites of different peoples living in Turkey. But in the 70s, with the rising labor movement and the rising socialist left, May Day, as the International Workers' Day, arrived to Turkey too. Now, especially in 1977, it faced a huge wave of repression. And in May Day 1997 in Taksim Square, there was this provocation by, well, we don't know who, whether it's the police or the Secret Service. It's like yet to be revealed after almost 50 years, 40 something years.
Don't hold your breath.
Thank you. After like 40 something years, it's yet to be revealed, but there was a bloodshed. in Taksim Square with this provocation, with this one single gunshot in the air. There was this huge uh, chaos that occupied uh, the square, and then when people tried to like get away from the area, they saw that the roads were blocked. So it was like, it's obvious that it was planned by the state. It was engineered, and dozens of people just died on the spot, um, including some of my relatives actually back in the day.
You know,
And
I was supposed to be in that march as well, but due to some circumstances that year, I could not go. And it was a bloodshed, as you mentioned.
mhm,
And
mhm,
actually, we are going to be showing some documentaries in this program from Turkey on the
mhm,
history 1977 May
mhm,
Day. And we are going to be covering it. And there, like you said, there are quite a lot of mysteries still that have
mhm,
not been revealed, especially, you know, the plane that's coming from elsewhere to Turkey,
mhm,
and people with American passports being, you know,
mhm,
given rooms just
mhm.
looking at the plaza, and the whole hotel
Exactly.
being emptied. And that is the hotel
Mhm.
where the fires came from, and
Yeah,
they immediately left after the event. So there are a
yeah.
lot of things.
It's tragic. It's tragic that, I mean, we're going to come to that, I'm sure, but it's tragic that that hotel building is still intact,
It
but the
is,
government wants to demolish the park right across it.
yes. The
Um,
Marmora, right? They call it
yeah, the
the
Marmara
Marmora
Hotel. Yeah,
Hotel. Yes.
yeah, yeah.
So that try to give us a view of why the Turkish government has been so so against all Mayday presentations, all Mayday celebrations. They have closed down the plazas where this is being held, and so.
Hmm.
Where does this animosity come from?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it's a capitalist government. So, and all across the world, the capitalist governments either repress or try to co-opt, workers' celebrations. Here in the United States, they replaced May Day with the so-called Labor Day,
Right.
which means like nothing. There are no parades. It's just a day off.
Mhm.
In Turkey, because it was like very bloody and relatively recent history, um, I mean, I'm still thinking of May Day 1977. Um, the capitalist governments of all sorts, of all parties, they want to repress that memory. They don't want that to resurface. They don't want the workers to claim their rights. They don't want the left to reveal or even question the dirty secrets of the Turkish state,
Mhm.
the state structure. And of course, after 1977, 3 years after that, there was a military coup that was like uh, detrimental to all sorts of worker struggle. So you clearly see that the Turkish capitalist state uh, wants to suppress um, workers' rights, workers' celebrations,
Mhm.
workers' activity, self-activity, as well as the memories of the past.
Exactly. And especially, like you very correctly stated, it was the years that were leading up to the military coup,
Hmm.
and the Turkish and the Kurdish working class was showing its strength,
Exactly.
and that was not to be tolerated by, as you mentioned, the capitalist state.
Hmm.
And they needed to be you know they needed to learn a lesson. That's how
Hmm.
the attack was made,
Hmm.
just to tell them,
Hmm.
you know, this is not your place. And Turkey was ready to integrate more into the imperialist circuits,
Absolutely.
which came in, like you said, 3 years later in 1980 and beyond. So even coming back to closer 2013, we saw the resistance, as it's called, the demonstrations around a park, Gezi Park.
Hmm.
And it lasted for months, and every
Hmm.
single, except for one, I believe, province in Turkey participated in this resistance, and it came out of
Hmm.
nowhere. And
Hmm.
the government just could not prevent
Hmm.
or stop these demonstrations. It was like a cat and mouse, 24 hours around the streets, the central
Hmm.
streets of
Hmm.
Istanbul. So, do you see any parallels between the Gezi resistance and the MayDay resistance
Hmm.
clashes that happened between the state forces and the working class?
Yeah. Well, it's more than a parallel. I believe there's an organic link. So in 2012, so exactly a year before the Gezi Rebellion, and I tend to call it a rebellion rather than a
Hmm.
resistance because it was an uprising. It was a
Hmm.
people's uprising. Um, anyway, so a year before the Gezi Rebellion, the government did the mistake of allowing people to go into Taksim Square for once in Mayday, and it was tremendous. There were like people from the 60s and 70s, left generation, and they all said, even in 1977 or even before 1977, we haven't seen anything like this. It was huge. It was tremendous. And I happened to be there actually. Um, and I witnessed with my own eyes, it was huge. It's like an ocean of people. The next year comes. Of course, the government is afraid of it. It bans the demonstration in Taksim. Now,
Which years are we talking about here?
this is the May Day I talked about is 2012.
2012. Okay.
Yes, and remember, this is the year. These are the years when Arab revolutions are
Arab
spreading
Spring.
across the region. In Egypt, in Tunisia, they have toppled these dictatorial governments,
Mm, mm.
and there was tremendous, tremendous movements all across the Middle East, as well as here in the United States at that point. With Occupy Wall Street and whatnot, and across the world. But anyway, and within that context, of course, the May Day celebration in Turkey is tremendous. The next year, the government is afraid it bans the celebrations and the parades and whatnot. I remember seeing this placard in 2013 May Day when groups were trying to enter Taksim Square, where uh, the parade is like traditionally held, right?
Right.
And the placard read, "Taksim is going to turn into Tahrir."
Mm. Like in
Tahrir is
Egypt.
the Egyptian, revolutionary square, and actually Tahrir is such a great name for that because it means liberation in Arabic.
Mm.
So anyway, so Taksim is going to become Tahrir. Now they couldn't enter the Taksim Square, of course. But a month after that, the Gezi rebellion made Taksim into Tahrir.
I see. Interesting parallels.
It's more than parallels because the same groups who wanted to celebrate May Day in Taksim were were there during the Gezi rebellion. They
Mm.
didn't start the rebellion. It was mostly a spontaneous movement, and it was tremendous and it was beautiful despite all its shortcomings, which we can discuss separately. But the working class sectors of the working class were there, sectors of the unions were there, and almost like almost all the left, I could say. of all brands were there.
Mhm. Yeah, especially there was a criticism in 1977 that it was the factions between the
Mm.
left were fighting, although that wasn't the reason for the massacre.
Mhm.
And it's nice to hear that they were all there together in 2012. But Mayday is a symbol of the working class, of their
Of course.
achievements and their
Mhm.
past. Uh, if you were to look at all the way from 1970s, let's
Mhm.
say, to today, do you
Mhm.
see any trends in the working class movement? Where is it going? Have they lost momentum, or are they gaining momentum in organization, in movements, in strikes?
Mhm.
And where are they going in Turkey today?
Well, 1970s, of course, is a very special episode. I'd say there is a nationwide, almost dual power situation
Mm,
throughout the country. Tremendous working class activity, tremendous socialist agitation, and socialist activity. Um, Sections of the police, sections of the army disobeying the capitalist state and sympathizing with the left and all that. Um, of course, the military coup cuts it. Until the 90s, there is a silence. There's like this re-spark, like it sparks up in the 90s again, and then it.
You
Uh,
mean you mean with the military coup of 1981? Is that
yes,
right? Okay,
yes, exactly.
1980.
So 80s are pretty silent in that regard. There is rekindling, so to speak, in the 90s till the mid to late 90s, and it then goes down again for like many reasons. And since the late 90s, I'd say up to our day, there has been a downward trend. Of course, there have been sparks here and there, such as 2008 Tekel resistance, the
Mhm.
Tekel strike against the privatization of um, the alcoholic beverage factories and all that stuff. Um, but
The state monopoly on alcoholic beverages, yes, it was privatized.
yeah, definitely. So there are moments of resistance until our point, but I'd say since the late 90s there has been a downward trend in workers' activity. I mean, you see that reflected in the unionization rate. You see that reflected in the sizes of uh, socialist organizations. You see that also in the rise of Hakish, which is the pro-government union, which is basically the agent of the capitalist state within the working class. Uh, so you see all these trends, but lately, I'd say since I want to say 2015, with the so-called metallic storm,
Mm.
the spontaneous wildcat strikes in the industrial heartland in Turkey, which didn't last very long, and it ultimately um, lost momentum and lost grounds and whatnot. But since 2015, there is a slow but steady resurfacing of working class activity and working class militancy. For 3 years now, since I'd say 2017 or so, or 2018 maybe, 2 3 years, the metal workers especially, so the auto workers, your auto workers, your you know uh, all sorts of like metal
Industrial workers.
montage, all these, like heavy industrial workers, they have been trying hard to go on strike. And they have been like
And
doing
also the mine workers.
the mine workers, exactly. Thank you for reminding that. They have been, working towards these things. There are attempts in many factories, to unionize. And I'm thinking mainly of Cargill, for instance,
Hmm.
where people lost their jobs because they wanted to unionize. Um, and Cargill is one example, of course, but there are many factories, many workplaces where people are trying to unionize or trying to organize rank and file activity within the union against the union bureaucracy. And they are, losing their jobs. They're threatened there by their bosses or the union bureaucrats themselves and all that. So there's a slow resurfacing of the working class activity, I'd say,
In the last 3 years, you're saying?
in the last 2, 3 years. Well, broadly in the last 5 years or so, but with many interruptions. But
Sure.
for the last 2, 3 years, there is like a steady trend, I'd say.
Do you think that the working class movement in Turkey, does it have sufficient links and relationships to other international working class organizations or movements, solidarity? Are
Mhm.
they working together?
Unfortunately, not. I mean, not nearly enough, not nearly sufficient. Um, there are links, of course, like the Turkish and Greek communist parties. I know are doing like joint events and stuff. The DIP in Turkey and EK in Greece are fraternal organizations and all that. But these things are not. I mean, they're nowhere near sufficient links.
Why
Um,
do you think that is? That
the
has
main
been a
reason, of course, is
historic.
nationalism.
Mhm.
And nationalism, of course, is a big tool in the hands of the union bureaucracy to separate the working class from its, um, I mean, class siblings across the world, and sabotage any global international solidarity event. When it comes to solidarity with the Middle Eastern working classes, it's even worse. It's even
Interesting, yeah.
worse because since the foundation of the republic, there has been this Orientalist view of the Turkish nation,
Mhm.
very operational. We are from now on. We're like looking westwards. Forget about the Ottoman past. Forget about your links and cultural similarities with the Middle East. Forget about all of that stuff. We are striving towards being Western, civilized people. And unfortunately, it has
That's the Turkish official ideology, right?
exactly official state ideology. And unfortunately, it has vibrations. I mean, it has, echoes within the Turkish left too. Uh, we're gonna if we want to make a socialist revolution, first we have to become a modern capitalist country.
Have they been able to
Um,
bridge this gap? Even let's forget even about the foreign working class
mhm.
movements, but within Turkey, let's say with the Kurdish working class.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I know there are a lot of socialist organizations who are, following closely the Kurdish movement, the PKK. But in terms of like working class activity, rank and file, union work, and all that stuff, it's been lacking tremendously. Um, and actually, we now need to talk about a different section and significant section of of the working class in Turkey too, which is absolutely abandoned. I'm thinking mainly of the Syrian
Refugees.
refugee, workers who are, living and working under the most horrendous conditions, hyper exploited, um, and I mean, I'll tell you this much: most of the, not all, but most of the Turkish or socialist parties and organizations of Turkey have not even been publishing anything, any appeals or any statements in Arabic language.
Mm.
or Kurdish language. Well, there is more Kurdish literature, but in Arabic language, it's nearly non-existent. There are only few parties and organizations who are doing that, and that is like invaluable effort. I mean,
Because I
that
think
is
Kurds are even looked at as citizens of Turkey, but the refugees from Arab countries are being treated as
dirt.
dirt. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, parasites. They came and took our jobs and all that.
Exactly. That's
I mean, I need to mention this. The Turkish government has played a very sinister uh, play with the Syrian refugees, because the main influx of the Syrian refugees were up to the year 2016, and these are also the years when the Kurdish towns were bombed in
precisely.
Turkey by the government. And what the Turkish government did is, all over Turkey, there's this Kurdish working class, which is working mostly informally, without, unions, without legal protection, without anything. What the Turkish government did in some cities is that they literally went to the bosses and said, "You're going to fire all the Kurdish workers you're employing." And the employer goes, "Okay, what am I supposed to do then? They're like super cheap labor. So with whom shall I replace them?" And then the state officials say, "We're going to find you even cheaper labor." And then they bring in Syrians.
Yeah.
So divide and conquer squared, if I may say.
Yeah, definitely.
There's already the distinction between the Kurdish and Turkish workers, and now they're bringing in Syrians and like replacing the Kurdish workers too. And the Syrians right now are living in the most horrendous conditions you can imagine.
There's a tragedy going on there, and yeah, it's just unbelievable situation. Not only in the working class, but they're being lynched on the street, and they're being chased and beaten, and their children are abused, and their women are just horrific conditions for them.
Of course.
So are there representatives of the working class in the parliament? I think the Workers' Party of Turkey is in the parliament, and HDP, the traditionally pro-Kurdish party, seems to be the only effective opposition in the parliament, because the major opposition party, CHP, is just like the Democrats here in the United States. They're part of the system. They're part of the state. So how can you explain if there is, or maybe you can go into the representation of workers in the National Assembly?
Well,
or in other political parties. I mean, it doesn't have to be in the National Assembly. They're political representation.
Sure. So right now, I mean, in terms of like political parties represented, one thing that we need to be aware of is that there's not one, but there are two fascist parties in the National Assembly, and there is a huge crisis of the left that one of the fascist parties was carried into the parliament. I'm thinking of the İyi Party,
right?
The so-called good party, as it literally translates. Through the support of the left, they were able to get into the parliament. It's a horrendous situation.
We need to remind our listeners that in the 1990s, there was a very dark time when more than 40,000 citizens were killed in the attacks the Turkish government, led against the Kurdish population.
Yes.
And during that time, the head of this İyi Party, which is in the opposition now, Akşener, was the interior minister, and on her watch,
Mhm.
17,500 people disappeared. There is
Exactly.
no trace of them. Many of
Exactly.
them maybe just killed on the
Mhm.
roadside, or they were tortured, but they
Mhm.
disappeared. And nobody is asking that question to this so-called,
Mhm.
opposition leader, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's a crime the left has committed to like carry that party into the parliament. It's horrendous. Now, as far as the parties go, as you mentioned, the CHP is. I'd say there. I mean, there are two sections of the Turkish bourgeoisie right now: the more Islamic-oriented ones and the more secular ones.
Hmm.
The one is not the one is not any better than the other. And the CHP and the AKP are their like respective representatives. Now, as far as HDT goes, I think I mean I see it as a broad party, broad like left-ish,
Hmm.
maybe borderline social democratic party with a lot of tendencies in it. There are more socialist tendencies, there are more left-wing revolutionary tendencies, and there also is there are also tendencies with, I mean, obsessed with identity politics, obsessed with different things. And I'd say they are that like that second part of the party is mainly the representative of the Kurdish bourgeoisie.
Hmm.
Um, of course, there's union leaders, there's socialist leaders, there are again different tendencies within the party, but it should be clear that HDP is not a workers' party or a socialist party. It is a broad left party with many, many, many tendencies in it.
Definitely, yeah.
Um, yeah. As far as the workers' part, the Workers' Party of Turkey goes, TIP.
Hmm.
Uh, well, there is a like a kind of a mysterious history behind that, which I'm not super familiar with, to be honest with you, because there was a split within the Communist Party of Turkey, and they split from it, and there was some like quite literally bloody fights between the two groups, and then they established the so-called Workers' Party. Now, how like to what extent they are representative of the working class, to what extent they have militants within the unions, to what extent they have been, doing rank and file organization. These questions need to be answered before we jump into conclusions about that. Of course, their two representatives have been great within the boundaries of the National Assembly, but without actual activity, without actual socialist agitation within the working class, and without rank and file organization, those wonderful speeches are but hollow. So the link to the working class is like the or actual link to the working class is the key.
I see. So where do you see this, the working class of Turkey, which includes Turkish,
Mm-hmm.
Kurdish, Syrian
Mm-hmm.
now. Where do you see it going in the future?
Uh, what do you mean by that question? Can you specify a
Uh,
little bit more?
yeah, like you mentioned, since 1970s, it has been going up and down and,
Mm-hmm.
fluctuations here. But in the last 3 years, as you mentioned, there are some signs of, being more organized or being more, challenging to the government.
Mm-hmm.
So in the near future, do
Mm-hmm.
you see this trend continuing or?
Absolutely,
Mhm. Go ahead.
absolutely. So I think there are things, two catastrophes that a capitalist government can face anywhere on the face of the earth. One is a natural disaster, including a pandemic. Two is, losing a war. Turkey is going through both. It is losing wars in Syria and Libya, and it is facing with a huge pandemic with almost zero infrastructure. And the agitation within the working class, the anger and frustration and loss of confidence into the bourgeois state is tremendous. Everybody, even before these two major events, there was a municipal election last summer in Turkey in 2019, and everybody celebrated it because after 25 years, Erdogan's party lost in Istanbul, and the municipality was transferred into the hands of the CHP. Everybody celebrated it, but most people fail to see that the voting rates as such, like no matter to what party, the voting rate of the population had gone down significantly. That means, people were already losing confidence in the bourgeois state as such, with all its sections, with all its parties. And right now, with the loss of wars and with the pandemic, people are frustrated and angry. Now the question is, of course, what are they going to do with it? Well, as I said, for the last 2-3 years, the metal workers have been trying to organize major strikes, and each time, 10 days or a week before the strike date, the union bureaucrats have been selling out at the very last minute.
Right.
At the very last minute. And the last one earlier this year in February, was, I think, very significant because the union leaders sold out. They shook hands with the government. Then literally the next day, the government went into war in Syria. To me, the link couldn't have been more clear. The government trying to buy off the upper sections of upper echelons of the working class. Well, I think this activity will continue, and probably once the pandemic, there is organization within during the time of the pandemic too, tremendous organization. But once people regain the confidence that they have lost with the pandemic striking, we will see tremendous working class activity in forms of strikes, resistances, and whatnot. Rebellions maybe. It's hard to foretell these things, but it's coming our way, for sure.
Well, thank you very much. It's been tremendous getting this information from you. As we said before, our guest, we cannot give his identity because of fear of retaliation of the Turkish government, but it has been tremendous, and he has agreed to come on our show, this 24-hour MayDay 2020 show, to give us his views on the working class movements in Turkey. So we really appreciate your time, and
thank you.
I'm sure we're going to have you again. And there are so many issues, like you said, the war in Syria and Libya and its connection to whether the Turkish government is going to survive or not, or approaching to Russia. So many different issues are here. But in the future, we will cover those with you again. Thank you very much, and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, welcome back to our Pacifica Network MayDay 2020 24-hour coverage around the world. We are covering the meaning and the history, as well as the current events in Turkey in this program. The coverage on many other workers' struggles from around the world, as well as here in the US, will continue after this program. Next, we go to a song, the MayDay song, as it's known in Turkey. When first it came out in 1976, the working class movement had already picked up steam and had started ascending, but the government too had escalated its attacks to prevent any more development on the left. When this song came out, it immediately became the symbol of MayDay and of the struggle. The song was composed for the adaptation of the theater of a book by Maxim Gorky. The book is called The Mother. The play was adapted by Bertolt Brecht, and the composer, Sarper Özcan, had composed the song and for this play, and it was first performed by Ankara Art Theater in the play. Ankara Art Theater is a legendary, revolutionary, and a very popular theater group. Later on, the theater was shut down, of course, and the actors suffered tremendously in the hands of the Turkish police apparatus after the 1980 military coup. The composer said he created this march for the scene in the book on the 1905 Russian Revolution, what is known as the Bloody May Day. In the text, in the book, the workers enter the plaza singing a march, but nobody knows what that march was. So the composer sat down and composed this song for that scene as the workers are marching in. However, the song had to represent the daily events in Turkey around 1976, where fascism was rising as well as the workers' movement, and clashes and the murders by the government at every street corner was going on. But the workers were organizing, and they were showing their force as well to resist this government's oppression. So the MayDay song even became the official song of the Workers' Party. But it wasn't only them. The entire left movements and the working class movements took this song and made it the common theme of the left in Turkey in those years. Later on, the composer said, "I never dreamt this song would become so popular and become like this." In the 1977 MayDay celebration, the song was performed by a choir on the stage, the 1977 Bloody May Day celebration. We have other segments coming up that will go more into the history and the documents of what happened around 1977 May Day, why it happened, the results. But here we are only introducing the song and the lyrics here. We will play the march in 4 different languages being spoken in Turkey. The first stanza is in Laz, the language of the Laz people in the northern Black Sea coast. Their origins are tied to the Greek and the Byzantine or empire. But today, Laz mostly have been assimilated in Turkish culture, and their language is very hard to find, but you can still find it in the remote villages in the northern regions. The second stanza is in Armenian. The 1915 genocide committed by the Turkish rulers of the Ottoman Empire on the Armenians defined the nature of the newly formed Turkish Republic and its genocidal tendencies that still live that still lives in the land today. This genocidal tendency is aimed against anybody who may identify themselves not as a Turk or from another religion, not Muslim. Around 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered, and what is known to be the first genocide of the 20th century, the modern Turkey was born out of this bloodshed. The very few Armenians exist in Turkey today. Those who were left behind from the genocide, mostly women and children, who barely survived were taken by the Turks and forced to change their religion, language, and identities. And they were forced to become Turks and Muslims. Their land and property were confiscated by the Turkish state. Even up to this day, the Turkish state holds their properties mostly, apart from the ones that were taken by the local powerful Turks. The third stanza is in Kurdish, the language that's being used by the Kurds in Turkey and in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. But the Kurds constitute about 20 to 25% of the population, mostly in the eastern provinces. And Kurdish is a banned language in Turkey. And many Kurdish activists, or just regular citizens, are rotting in jails, prisons, because they have used their mother language, Kurdish. The fourth stanza in the song we're going to play is in Turkish, the original language. Now, in the song you're going to hear the four different languages repeat the first stanza, although in different languages, of course. But we wanted to give the full lyrics. So in the subtitles, we have written the entire lyrics, and the subtitles don't correspond to the actual song being sung because they're only repeating the first stanza. So for our audience on the radio, the lyrics go as such. The only things brought by these days are oppression, torture, and blood. But it will not continue like this. The exploitation will have to end. A brand new life will emerge for us and everywhere else. May 1st, the holiday of the workers and the laborers. The holiday of the peoples marching on the glorious path of the revolution. A brand new sun will rise from the tops of the mountains. A happy new life buds from the horizons of this fight. The happy days of my land is surely in the days to come. Don't let people believe in lies or to stay silent. Educate the people so they fight for their rights. It is only in our hands we find the bright days of the future. The thunderous sounds of the nations surround the ground and the sky. The toughest of the peoples smashes down like a sledgehammer. The glorious wave of revolution spreads around the globe. The day will come when the tyrants have but to leave. They will melt away like a paper in the path of the glorious revolution.
Mevki, Luis,
Hi, this is Mehmet Bayram, and we have just heard the MayDay March, the most popular symbol of MayDay in Turkey, in 4 different languages that's being spoken in the land today. We heard it in Laz, the Armenian, the Kurdish, and Turkish. This concludes the first part of the MayDay 2020 coverage on the Pacifica Network on Turkey today. We have 24-hour coverage on May Days around the world. So make sure to please follow the other programs on this channel here. On the second part on Turkey, we will be talking to the editor-in-chief of a major opposition news and media site in Turkey, the Sendika.org. And we will also cover the historical Bloody May Day of 1977, which we kind of touched here a little bit. So it would be great to go back and see what happened. And we are also gonna hear many songs that are being sung today in relationship to the Workers' Day and the May Day in Turkey. So thanks for joining us, and hope you will follow again on the second part. And please do follow the other coverages around the world today on this channel. Thank you.